there, this is Dennis Anyone with Dennis Hensley. It's a podcast about making things up and making things happen. I love talking to creative people about their work and their journeys. And today my guest is an author. His name is Carl Siciliano. He is the founder of the Ali Forney Center in New York City. It's a homeless shelter for LGBTQ youth that he founded a number of years ago, over 2 decades ago. And the subtitle of his book is 3 Decades of Fighting for Beds, Belonging, and a Safe Place for LGBTQ Youth. And I love this book so much. I thought that he told the story of the center and his background before that, working in that same field, in a really interesting way because it dives deep into themes of faith and disappointment and love, and it's rich and beautiful and deep. And he also just tells the story of what happened, how the center almost, closed a number of times, and the political ups and downs and navigating that whole world. But it's just a really rich book because he wrestles with a lot of interesting stuff, and he writes about it in a beautiful way. And I got so into it, I made so many notes in the book that this ended up being a 2-parter. So in part 1, which we'll get to in a moment, we have an amazing Bea Arthur story. If you're a fan of Bea, you're going to enjoy that, and lots of other great stuff. But before we get to that, I want to remind you that this podcast, Dennis Anyone, is brought to you by no one but me. I do it. I love it. It's very fun and fulfilling for me, and your support, though, helps me keep it going, helps me cover my expenses, and that means a lot. And there are 2 ways you can support the podcast. You can go to DennisAnyone.net, and you can leave a tip in my virtual tip jar, help me cover my expenses like web hosting, different things like that. And the other thing you can do is you could become a subscriber to DNR Studios. I'm part of a group of shows in the Derek and Romaine family. For a monthly fee, you get my show early, and you get all these other great shows too. So check that out at dnrstudios.com. All right, enough of the plugs. Here is part 1 of my interview with Carl Siciliano. Joining me now from upstate New York, it's Carl Siciliano. He is the author of the new book, Making Room, 3 Decades of Fighting for Beds, Belonging, and a Safe Place for LGBTQ Youth. He is the founder of the Ali Forney Center in New York, and he's here on the pod. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Dennis.
I just finished reading your book. I cried multiple times, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But you're the founder of the Ali Forney Center. It's a center for LGBTQ youth in New York City. And I have heard of the center. I'd heard the name. I live in LA, but I'd heard the name, and people donate, and this is a fundraiser, and Madonna showed up at the, it had been on my radar, but I didn't know who Ali Forney was. And usually with buildings that are named after people, it's usually rich people that give money. It's usually David Geffen or somebody, and that is not the story. And one of my favorite parts of your book is learning about Ali Forney. So when somebody just says to you casually, well, who is that? Who was that? What do you say?
That's an interesting question.
Because I'm sure you get that in a casual way. Like, I'm sure there's times where you have time to really talk about it. But when people just say, wait, who's the center named after?
So Ali Forney was a non-binary black young person who had been living on the streets since the time they were essentially 12 years old. And I met them in 1994 at a drop-in center called Safe Space in Times Square, New York City. Ali was remarkable in several ways. A lot of homeless youth have been really badly failed by adults. It's like a lot of them, their parents maybe have addiction issues or mental health issues, or are terribly homophobic or transphobic and, beat them and stuff. So, it's just really common for kids that are homeless to be very distrusting of adults, to have a lot of guard up, to wonder how you're going to fail them next. And Ali just had this ability to love and to trust and to take delight in the folks around that was just really endearing, really striking. And then Ali also really had this remarkable way of creating a sense of family amongst the kids in the street. this was a time when there were really no economic opportunities for homeless kids other than sex work or drug dealing. And the HIV infection rates amongst New York City's queer homeless youth were just, off the charts. And Ali was really dedicated to protecting the other young people who were doing sex work from HIV and AIDS, was very committed to bringing hundreds of condoms out every night to give out to the young people in the streets and to educating them. And was also willing to advocate for the young people with the police in ways that just took a lot of courage. There was a string of murders of homeless transgender sex workers, and Ali would go to the police precincts and demand that they be investigated, that their lives be treated like they had some import. Because in those days, a homeless transgender sex worker, they never investigated their murders. So Ali, to sum it up, I would say that Ali had a lot of love, had a real strong capacity for love. Like that was Ali's superpower. Ali had a great heart. And Ali personally gave me a lot of love. So, you started off by saying often buildings and programs are named after rich people who give something extraordinary.
Right. Well, it's the person that gave the money and they named the bridge after them. You know what I mean? Like it's that.
I think the most extraordinary thing we can give in our lives is love. And Ali really knew how to do that.
What was striking in the book is that Ali was not like the teacher's pet student or person that would come into the center. Like Ali was sassy. He would throw a lot of shade, or you also in the book you gender Ali both. So I may kind of muff that up a bit. But
don't worry about that. Yeah, I mean Ali existed in a time before there was really like this language of non-binary that we use now, and they and them. So when I describe Ali now, in conversation, I usually say they, but in writing the book, I was trying to be as accurate as possible to Ali's life, and Ali would alternate between male and female pronouns, so I do that in the book.
Yeah. But Ali was a sex worker. Ali enjoyed or used drugs. Ali was sassy with you. Like, it wasn't like, the perfect kid that came in. Like, you know what I mean? But it was a spirit that Ali had that made it, that made what he or she contributed extraordinary, and that like you described, affected everyone that Ali came in contact with. Yeah,
it was a real common occurrence when I first started working with homeless youth. There were barely any shelter beds for them in New York City, and you had the crack epidemic was really impacting them pretty heavy duty back in the 90s. AIDS was impacting them. There was a lot of drug dealing. So there was a lot of violence. It was very violent to be a homeless queer youth on the streets. And our kids would get murdered. And like every couple of months, one of the young people in our care would get murdered in the streets. So we would have these series of memorial services at the church next door. We were like next door to St. Mary the Virgin Church. And usually when we'd have the memorial services for the young people, we'd have to have them in this little side chapel, because usually like 10 or 12 people would show up, and it would just seem pathetic to have 10 or 12 people in this huge, church. So
right.
we'd do it in the side chapel. The only young person where we ever used the main church for their funeral was Ali, because so many people loved Ali. Like, people came from every program in the city, all the programs serving youth. I mean, we had about 100 people at Ali's funeral.
Right.
Ali just, had this ability to love people, and you don't have to be some perfect person to love people,
Yeah.
It's like we're all pretty broken and we all have our issues. So when I see somebody that seems all perfect, I usually think, they do good PR on themselves.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's not how life is. We're broken. And Ali went through some awful things in life, and carried some awful wounds. But nonetheless, Ali had the ability to open her heart and love people profoundly. And that's, what was remarkable.
And Ali got to walk the runway with Tyra Banks. Pretty incredible. How did that come about? How did that happen?
So, I was running this drop-in program called Safe Space,
right,
in Times Square. Our parent organization was called the Center for Children and Families. And they had a bunch of other programs, mostly in Queens, that were, like for kids in foster care and mental health services for families that were struggling and programs like that. And Tyra Banks had become the celebrity spokesmodel for our organization.
Nice.
But had told the organization that she was really interested in programs with young kids.
Right.
Like, she wasn't initially interested in coming to my program where it was 18, 19, 20, 22-year-olds. She wanted to go to the programs where they were 6 or 7. But I ran into her in the hallway of where our main office was in the Puck building, where you always used to see Will and Grace.
Right.
And I just couldn't believe how gorgeous she looked when I ran into her in the hallway. And I knew that a lot of our youth, the gay boys and the transgender girls, just thought she was fabulous. So, I was just like, Tyra, it would be the greatest thing ever if you came to this drop-in center for homeless kids and shared a little bit of your fabulous beauty with us. And then so she said she would do it. And then, I don't know, about 2 months later, I got summoned to go down to the Soho Grand Hotel where I met her in the lobby, and we drove up in her limousine. And when we got to the drop-in center, to Safe Space, Ali was waiting at the street corner, and Tyra stepped out of the limousine, and Ali was like, "Girl, whoever did your hair and makeup for the American Music Awards was not your friend."
Right? That's what I was saying. Not like the perfect kid. You know what I mean? Sassy. But Tyra laugh? How did Tyra react? Yeah.
She laughed. And she just said, I know a lot of people told me it wasn't my best look.
Right.
And then he goes, "Ooh, and that Toni Braxton was shady to you?" And Tyra was like, yeah, she was upset that I was giving her her award because I was so much taller than she was. So
right.
She had an attitude. And Ali was like, "Ooh, girl, you could see the attitude." But, within minutes, it was like they were best friends.
Right.
And they were the same age. I mean, Tyra and Ali were each about 21 or 22 at that time.
Right.
And they just bonded immediately. And at the end of the visit, when she was getting back into the limousine, Ali was just like, "Girl, we put on this talent show every year, and it's the highlight of my year. And if you walked runway with us, the children would gag."
Right.
And she was like, "You know what, Ali? If I can be in New York when you have your talent show, I will be there." And 6 months later, we had our talent show down by where the World Trade Center was at Brooklyn, the Borough Manhattan Community College. And Tyra walked runway with Ali.
Yeah.
I have some great video of the two of them.
Amazing.
And they really bonded and connected to each other. And it was Ali had a charisma. Ali had just a charisma that drew people to her. And one of the people that got roped in by that charisma was Tyra Banks.
Right. She's not immune, Miss Banks. One of the things that you and Ali shared is a kind of faith. It's a big part of both of your lives, even though dealing with all kinds of different hardships. I wrote a quote down from the article, from the book. Let me see if I can find it. This was something you wrote about, I think, in relation to both of you. The God whose name was used to persecute us was simultaneously the bedrock of our strength. So that was something that Ali had in spite of everything he was up against in this life. He had a faith. Did you ever see that shaken with him? Did you ever sense that Ali was giving up on his belief in God?
No. I had the sense that Ali's faith in a God of love was the bedrock. That was sort of the ground out of which Ali was able to be so loving. It's interesting. Overwhelmingly, the young people who come to the Ali Forney Center, that I work with, who have faced violence and abuse in their homes, when we ask them why, they say it's because of the religious beliefs of their parents.
Right. It's the number one thing.
Yeah. And I mean, so much of my book is dealing with that, with just the cruelty and the brutality with which young people are discarded and expelled from their homes because of who they are. And Ali, and I will never forget the first time we did the talent show. We would put on this talent show every year.
Yeah, it sounds amazing.
We worked with this wonderful performing artist named Faye Simpson, and she would, we had, our dining room had like a dancer's bar along the edge of the room, and it had like lined with mirrors. So it was a great rehearsal space for dancers. So we would let her use that space, and in return, she would work with our young people and, in performance art to help them put on a talent show.
Right.
And she would spend months working with them on their acts. And I'll never forget the first time we did the talent show. This would have been the summer of 95. It was like people voguing and people rapping and people singing I Believe I Can Fly, and, all the kind of stuff that you would normally, like a high school talent show, maybe with more voguing than and runway walking than would have been in most high schools. But, then Ali got up and sang His Eyes on the Sparrow, which was Ali's favorite song. And then Ali started to preach, this kind of sanctified preaching.
Wow.
And, could I read what Ali said?
Yes,
it just
please.
made such an impact on me.
Yeah, take your time getting it. We can always trim it down. I also want to point out before you do the reading that if the listeners hear a little chirp sound, you have multiple parrots, which you told me about in the email, and I'm delighted. I say the more the merrier. How many do we have?
Well, in my room where I am right now, I've got my two Pioneer parrots, Milo and Sweetie.
Right on. So they may weigh in if you do a good job. They may weigh in if my questions are lame. Do they speak? Do they say words?
No, these ones don't.
Right.
However, in another room, we've got two blue and gold macaws. And there's JJ, who will say things like, shut up, sit your butt down.
Where did he pick that up? Is that stuff that gets said around your house a lot?
My husband Raymond had JJ for many years, and he would when his dogs would make too much noise, he'd be like, sit down, sit your down. And JJ just picked it up.
Right.
So when the other animals in the house start making too much noise, JJ will be like, shut up, sit your butt down.
Right.
And then our other parrot, Juan Pablo, he only says one thing, Maxwell. We have a dog named Maxwell, and so he'll just go, Maxwell.
That's amazing. Parrots are amazing. Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
All right. So you were going to read a section from your book a little bit about this talent show.
Yeah. So then Ali caught the ghost and seeged into a free-form sermon, no doubt inspired by the church services she'd attended as a child. With a miraculous combination of abandon and self-possession, she began preaching in a rhythmic half-chant. I believe that one day the Lord will come back to get me. Hallelujah. If I live right, hallelujah, I will go on to that righteous place. I believe that one day, hallelujah, all my trials, all my tribulations, they will all be over. I won't have to worry about crying and suffering no more. I won't have to worry about being disappointed because my God, hallelujah, is coming back to me. Ali strode back and forth with a jaunty gravitas at the front of the stage, one hand occasionally slapping her leg or resting for a moment on her hip. Each line was punctuated by a bluesy chord on the electric organ. Every so often, Ali stopped walking and leaned toward the audience to emphasize a certain syllable, sometimes drawing it out, more song than speech. Whether I'm a man with a dress and a wig, my God will love me for who I am. I might not walk like I'm supposed to walk. I might not have sex with who I'm supposed to have sex with. My God will love me for who I am.
Wow. And spontaneous, right? Not planned?
Yeah, Ali just kind of caught the ghost and would burst out into these, unplanned things. Thing is, Ali did it like for 3 years. For 3 years, we had those talent shows, and it was always a variation on the same theme.
Right.
No, it was always like, God has mercy on all people for who they are. God loves all people for who they are. God loves me for who I am. And that was like the bedrock. And what I was really struggling with in my own life at that time was just the sense of being kind of devastated by the homophobia that I'd experienced in the Catholic Church.
Right.
I had this very profound experience of a loving God as a kid on my own. Like, I didn't even grow up religious.
Right. You write about it beautifully. It happened when you were quite young, like 8?
15.
15, sorry. Yeah, but you were, and it was just something that, it wasn't a family thing, that you just had this moment on your own that led you to this more religious path. Yeah,
and I spent some time in 2 monasteries.
Right.
I spent time serving the poor and living with homeless people in something called the Catholic Worker Movement.
Right.
Spent several years in New York City and Washington, D.C. in those communities. But as I started coming out of the closet, I just experienced like this rejection. From the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which at that time in 1986, 1987 was really stepping up the homophobia. I experienced, some profound rejecting experiences in the Catholic worker communities that I was in. And I was kind of angry and bitter about it.
Right.
And felt very disappointed. And, I looked at Ali and I was just like, look, this kid has gone through 1,000 times worse rejection than I could even dream of. But they're so anchored in like this reality of a kind of divine compassion, divine mercy, divine acceptance, that they were able to just sort of push the religious rejecting crap to the side and cling to what was at the heart of the matter. And I was so personally inspired by that. Like, I just, I've spent the rest of my life kind of just clinging to those moments when Ali would do that, because they are kind of my touchstone for like what reality is about.
Well, they also help you in moments when institutions seems to be going backwards in terms of LGBTQ acceptance. Like talking about, there was a time when it seemed like the Catholic Church that you were around was a little more open. There was a place at least that people could be, and then it went backwards. And the way that must have felt, and also then the political winds change and the society at large seems to go backwards. It must be very hard to sort of keep any kind of faith going through those kinds of headwinds when you think you're going one way and then it's 2 steps back kind of feeling.
Yeah. I mean, over the years, I've meditated a lot on the fact that, Jesus had a lot to say about how religions abuse people, judge people, condemn people. And, he experienced that in a pretty brutal way. I mean, it was murdered. I've gotten to the point where I don't expect religion to be sweet and nice and accepting. I think religions are made up of people, and so the failings of people are the failings of religions. I think that we tend to be rigid and we tend to be judgmental and we tend to be cruel at times. And so those things embed themselves into these institutions. But, I still want to cling to the heart of the matter. And I think the heart of the matter is love. And, Ali was able to, my God will love me for who I am. Like, you could tattoo that on my heart. So.
Before you started the Forney Center, there was Safe Space. And before that, you were working with the homeless. Was there ever a time when you thought, I'm going to do something else? I'm going to get my real estate license. Did you ever think of just changing your trajectory?
No.
No, it's okay. But it's like that was the beginning of what you did and all the way through the Forney Center.
Yeah, I wanted to write and be creative more than I often had an opportunity to. So, that was something that I thought about a lot. But I never thought of it as an either or. Doing the work that I've done in my life has been, extraordinarily hard, but also very gratifying.
Yeah.
I just met a lot of wonderful, wonderful people. I've worked with, some just profoundly generous and kind-hearted people. And, many of the homeless people that I've worked with, both adults when I was younger and youth later, were just, moved me to my core. So, I feel like I've had a very rich life.
Yeah. Well, you write about it beautifully in the book. You talk about how so many of these kids that end up coming to these centers were thrown out of their homes because of religion. Is that more of an American thing than in other places in what you've observed? I'm asking because I had a guest on who is an author. He's Iranian American. So he grew up here, but he said that he believes that the Iranian culture is quite homophobic, but his parents would never think of throwing him out. Like that was not they would figure out something. But the idea of casting people out was something that he felt was not part of his culture. Does this happen all over the world, or is it something about the American fabric and the way religion is in our culture?
Well, I would say that part of the issue in the United States that undergirds the whole experience of homelessness is just economic inequality. And I think the United States is terribly unequal economically.
And getting more so every day. And people fear that they're losing something all the time.
Yeah. So I think that puts people at risk of homelessness. So I think that there's a kind of mass homelessness in the United States that you don't necessarily see everywhere. But having said that, this is not the reality of LGBTQ young people being rejected by their families is not an American phenomenon. It's an international phenomenon. And we have people coming to the Ali Forney Center from all over the world. With the migrant immigration crisis right now, a lot of immigrant youth who are queer are, showing up at the Ali Forney Center. But throughout the whole time that I've been doing this work, like always about 15% at least, a minimum of 15% of the young people would be from other countries.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can kind of almost do a barometer of like where the most homophobic and transphobic regions in the world are by where, young people would be coming from.
Yeah.
Because we get a lot of kids from like the Caribbean, like Jamaica. A lot of kids from Jamaica would come. We'd get kids from Russia and Eastern Europe, not as much from Western Europe, but we would get kids from Eastern Europe. We've gotten kids from Israel. So, yeah, you get a sense of like, and often it's like the areas where there's like a really kind of conservative, strict religiosity is where the young people are most at risk. Actually, since I stepped down as the leader of the Ali Forney Center 4 years ago, and one of the things that I've been doing is I'm still involved, and I'm working with groups around the country and around the world who are developing housing for LGBT youth, kind of based on the Ali Forney Center's model. So right now, I'm working with groups in the United Kingdom, in Poland, in El Salvador, all over the world. Like we're hooking up a meeting with a group in Australia. So yeah, it is completely an international phenomenon.
In addition to the portraits of the kids that would come, and they're so memorable and moving and fun and interesting. They're just all the colors. There's sort of the politics of it going on, and some of that stuff is interesting. And there were a number of times where you very shrewdly used the media to get sort of what you needed for the center. I thought that was very well played. You did that multiple times. Can you talk a bit about that? How you would sort of go, okay, you know what? If we shone a light on this, this might make a difference. I thought that was very shrewd.
Yeah, I guess I have good media instincts. And, it wasn't something that anybody ever trained me in. But I learned it really when Ali died. I mean, when Ali died, I was so devastated. And, I kind of felt like I couldn't even cope anymore. Like, I just couldn't cope with seeing these kids killed in the streets with no safe shelter. And, I kind of got to this point where I was like, okay, either I have to quit and do something different because this is just too painful, or I have to change the structure of how youth are treated in New York City when they're homeless. And I was like, God, how do I do that?
You can either go big or go home. Like, it's one of the two.
Yeah. Like, it wasn't enough to run a nice program.
Right.
I had to fundamentally figure out a way to change how youth were treated.
Right.
Who were on the streets in New York.
And because Ali's death also was so sad and tragic, gunshot wound.
I mean, at that time, there were like thousands of kids that we were working with.
Right.
There were about 170 beds in the whole city, maybe 150. So most of the youth were just stranded out on the streets. And then the only provider for homeless youth was this Catholic organization that was just really homophobic.
Right.
And transphobic. So, it was a shit show. It was like a total shit show, like some kind of third world hell that these kids were living in, sleeping in the subways, sleeping in crack houses, building like cardboard box shelters for themselves along the piers by the Hudson River. It was just really bad stuff. So yeah, I felt like I had to change it. And I was racking my brain trying to figure out how to do that. And, I thought, let me get media to deal with the fact that Ali was murdered. I was able to get a New York Times editorial writer to come to Ali's memorial service. And in her article, not only did she write about like the heartbreak of what had to happen to Ali, it came out that New York City, the mayor Giuliani was the mayor at that time.
Right.
It came out that the city had been given millions of dollars by New York State to develop more shelter for homeless youth. And Giuliani couldn't be bothered to spend it because it was like a 60-40 match. Like, the state would give 60% and then the city had to give 40%.
Right.
He wasn't willing to cough up that 40%. So they were sitting on unspent millions of dollars that were meant to house these kids while Ali and the others were being murdered in the streets. And it became kind of it became a scandal. And to have it in the editorial page of the New York Times, it just forced their hands to start spending the money. And so when I saw that, I saw that like politicians don't like to be in scandals, and they don't like to look bad, and they don't like to look cruel. And leaving homeless kids in the streets is not a good look.
Not a good look.
So throughout the years, whenever politicians were taking steps to cut the beds or to refuse to add the beds that were needed, my first instinct was always to go to the media and figure out ways to expose that. And I knew that the politicians would hate that.
Right.
So yeah, I over time, I just built a stronger and stronger media profile. And it got to the point where the politicians knew that if they did something shitty to homeless kids, I would put out a press release and get covered.
Yeah.
And so that would kind of prevent them to a certain extent. One of the greatest allies I ever had and continue to have was Joe Jervis, Joe My God.
Yeah, the blog, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll never forget. in 2010, Mayor Bloomberg put out this mid-year budget adjustment. The budget in New York City, it's like from July 1st to June 30th. And I was about to go home for Thanksgiving, and I opened the mail. I should have never done that. There was a letter from the city saying that they were cutting the drop-in center fundings in half and eliminating funding for street outreach for homeless kids. So it sort of ruined my Thanksgiving weekend.
Yeah.
In a big way. And I was really struggling to get the media to cover it. Bloomberg and then later Cuomo were both like really signaling their support for LGBT marriage equality.
Right. That was the big thing.
Yeah. And so it felt like the queer media wasn't wanting to criticize them very much because they were like, amongst the few leaders willing to take this public stand in support of our community. So, it felt like they were getting a pass on being cruel to homeless kids, most of whom were queer.
Right.
Which really pissed the hell out of me.
Yeah.
And then Bloomberg did this crazy thing. I mean, he got edited out of the book, so I'm telling you a story.
Oh, good. A scoop. I love it. All right.
Yeah, no, I wrote a lot more than could end up in the book. So he was doing these cuts, and then there was this big snowstorm in the city that December or January. And all of the city leaders were on vacation when it happened. And it took like 12 days or something for certain outer borough neighborhoods to get their streets plowed. It was like a scandal. And everybody was like, Mayor Bloomberg has fallen asleep on the job. And then that was the time when like Tyler Clemente and a number of other high profile suicides had occurred because of bullying. And Dan Savage had just started his "It Gets Better" campaign.
Right.
Where all these celebrities and people started making videos saying, hang in there, it's going to get better. So Mayor Bloomberg was the first Republican leader to release an "It Gets Better" video. And he released this video like 2 or 3 days after he'd cut the funding for homeless kids in half. And he actually said, if you're not accepted where you live, come to New York. It'll be better for you here. So I saw this and I just was like, oh my fucking God. How dare he?
Right.
How dare he like cut the funding for the most desperate queer kids in half and eliminate, some of the services they need to stay alive and put out this stupid "It Gets Better" video. So I was like driving into the city when I saw this happen. I pulled off to the side of the road. I must have just gotten a phone or something. And these were like, when you were first getting your first phones.
Right.
And I banged out, a press release, sent it to Joe My God. He put it up immediately. And that opened up like the floodgates. Like for the next couple of weeks, if you Googled Mayor Bloomberg, the first thing that would come up was Siciliano slams Bloomberg. Like it just got such pickup, and he backed off. He restored the funding. It took about a week, but he restored the funding, and it was because of the media attention. Like you don't want to look like a cruel, cold-hearted asshole to homeless children in the media.
But you also had not just the foresight, but also the balls to do it. I think that would take a little bit of like, all right, let's put out this press release. I think I have that thing of like, I don't want to upset anybody kind of gene, but I'm trying to work on not having so much. But I still think it took a little bit of balls to mix it up like that. Has that always been part of your personality, or is that something you developed?
It's weird.
It's a fight. You're a fighter.
I always thought of myself as this kind of gentle, sweet person or whatever.
Nice Italian boy, like you said in that meeting.
There's a warrior side to me, which came out after Ali died.
Interesting.
It's like it enrages me that political leaders think it's okay to leave homeless children in the streets.
Right.
It enrages me. And I know that it's a matter of life and death. You know, having lived through so many kids being killed, like, I know it's not some simple little thing. You know, it's not like just, a policy issue. It's life and death.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so grossly inhumane to leave children out in the streets. So I can't tell you the number of times I've had, the mayor would never call me and the governor would never call me. They would sort of have their henchmen call me.
Right.
They would have like their LGBT representatives like call me and make all these veiled threats.
Well, you write about Cuomo, and the tone of that first part of that chapter reminded me of all the stories that came out about Cuomo's bullying sort of after he sort of fell from grace and all of that sort of intimidation. Because at the time he was like, New York won, COVID king. And then all of this other stuff behind the scenes came out. And that's what I was thinking about as I was reading part of that. I don't know if that's how you would characterize it, but I was like, oh, this sounds kind of like what was going on in some of those other situations during that time.
Yeah, Cuomo was a piece of work.
Right.
Cuomo was like one of these people where it's like he'll punch you in the face and then like have you thrown out to the curb if you don't thank him for it.
Right.
Like, thank you for your gracious touch.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a few months after this whole debacle with Bloomberg cutting the funding in half, Cuomo had just gotten elected and released his first budget proposal. And he was proposing to cut funding for New York State in half for homeless youth. And I was just beside myself. Like, he'd been the secretary of HUD, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, before he became the governor back during the Clinton administration. I'd assumed you would have some compassion for homeless people. But here we were in a situation where there weren't nearly enough beds to begin with, where most of the homeless kids in the city were sleeping in the streets. And then you're going to cut the few beds that they've got? I was like, this is outrageous. So, it took a while because, again, like the queer press initially didn't want to critique him because
they had their eye on the marriage prize.
Yeah, yeah. And when they finally did start to critique him, when I finally broke through and got a lot of press about it, they were not happy. They felt like I was kind of screwing up their narrative that Cuomo was like the great gay savior. Yeah. And, but here's the thing. I was able to get Bloomberg to back off. I was not that year able to get – Cuomo did cut the funding in half. Like, we didn't lose beds in New York because Christine Quinn and Lou Fidler, who were the speaker of the city council and the chair of the youth committee of the city council, stepped in and used discretionary council money to restore the cuts that Cuomo had made. But all over the state, like, these barely funded homeless youth organizations lost funding, and it was terrible. So, but you said, it takes courage, and it does take courage. It was never easy. It was never easy to go up against the political leaders and critique them so savagely in the press. I was in a little bit of a unique position because I was the founder of my organization.
Right.
Like,
there was no,
a lot of times, like, leaders of organizations are hired by their board, and, the board is, as they should be, very concerned about the financial health of the organization. So critiquing an entity that gives you your funding is not easy.
Right.
It's hard. It's hard to be a strong advocate when you depend on the money that you get from the folks that you have to criticize.
Yeah. Speaking of, go ahead.
But like I said, I think that because I was the founder of the organization, like, I'd brought the board together. They hadn't hired me. I'd brought them together. And what I think both me and the board and the politicians learned over time was that my ability to have a high media profile inoculated me to a certain extent. Because I think the politicians knew that if they cut our funding in retaliation, it would be a huge media story.
Yeah.
So over time, I got to the point where they would threaten me and stuff. I mean, I have to tell you, it's like over the years, I organized many rallies, like, in front of City Hall and things like that. I don't think I ever organized a rally where I didn't have either somebody from the governor's office or somebody from the mayor's office call me and make threats.
Wow. Like, beforehand, if you go through with this, ...
Like, they would never say like, oh, we're going to take your funding away. Yeah. They would say, oh, you were really making a mistake. This is very destructive.
It's a very nice youth center. We'd hate to see something happen to it.
You're taking actions that could backfire on the homeless kids that you serve. And that would be a terrible thing to do. And, like they would say things like that to me. And by the end, by the last couple of years, I would just be like, this is just part of what I have to go through to put this rally on.
I've heard this song before.
I wasn't taking it seriously anymore, but in the beginning, it was really scary because I didn't know if it would follow through.
Yeah. If you're listening to this and you're a fan of Bea Arthur, you're going to be even more of a fan after you read Carl's book. Talk to me about Bea Arthur. She was an extraordinary supporter of the center in ways that you didn't even realize until after she'd passed.
Well, I knew she was extraordinary in her support while she was still alive, but she upped the ante from beyond the grave.
I love the story of you pulling off the road and sort of, just you're overwhelmed and you're praying and you're thinking about Bea as one of the people. Anyway, talk a little about that. It's a magical moment in the book.
Let me step back a little bit from that.
Sure.
So, in 2005, we'd been open for 3 years. I started the Ali Forney Center in 2002. And by 2005, we only had 12 beds and, like hundreds of kids wanting to get into those beds. And a man named Ray Clausen came to volunteer for us, saw how, poor we were, how grassroots, how much need there was. He was like a high-profile set designer for like Broadway shows and like award ceremonies. Like he designed sets for Elvis, for Judy Garland, for Madonna. And he had done the set designing for Bea Arthur's one-woman show on Broadway back in 2002, 2003. So he reached out to all the celebrities that he knew saying, would somebody come and please put on a benefit for these poor kids, who are out in the street with nowhere to go. And the only person that responded was Bea. And Bea flew to New York, in the middle of the winter. She hated winter so much she didn't even have a coat. She had to borrow Angela Lansbury's coat.
That's great. A great detail.
Yeah, they're very close friends. And put on this amazing performance for us. We raised like $45,000, which at that time was like by far the most we'd ever raised from any kind of benefit. But then afterwards, she started going to the media and saying, it's unacceptable that parents are throwing their children out for being LGBT. That's inhumane. And I would do anything for these kids. And the Ali Forney Center is saving lives. And so, to have a star of Bea's magnitude, like especially within the LGBT community,
right?
Like, talk about us that way, it really kind of put us on the map in a way that we hadn't been before. And it really upped our profile and helped people to start to see the importance of the work we were doing.
Yeah.
In New York City, there are like 28,000 nonprofit organizations. It's hard to have your profile elevate to the point where people hear your name and know what you're doing and know what your work is about and know the importance of it. And Bea's support was just a really, really important step for us of getting beyond that kind of massive anonymity. But then, fast forward 3 years.
Well, wait, can we go back and mention that your husband got to be her bodyguard for a bit, which was a dream come true because he's a Golden Girls fan?
So my husband, Raymond, is like, he's built like a defensive lineman in the NFL. And he is the biggest Bea Arthur fan you could imagine. And pretty much every night of his life, he watches the Golden Girls reruns.
They hold up.
So, he pretty much knows every line by heart. So Bea does this big performance, and then we have this after party. And, there are hundreds of like crazed, obsessed Bea Arthur homo fans, like thronging at her at this after party, like grabbing at her and all this mess. And I was like, oh my God, I should have, planned security. I hadn't anticipated there would be this huge, crush of people pawing at poor Bea Arthur. And, she was in her mid 80s and, had just put on this huge show. I mean, she was exhausted. And so I roped Raymond in and said, would you please be her bodyguard? So Raymond, made everybody line up. He was like, you can't touch her. You can talk to her, but you can't touch her.
Right.
And he would only let them be there for 30 seconds. And he was like, move on, next.
He ran a tight ship.
So Raymond took control of the crowd. And, but, he didn't know that this was going to happen. So
right.
At one point, he had to go to the bathroom. He had not prepared himself by emptying his bladder. And, Bea grabbed him with this iron grip and was like, where the hell do you think you're going? So, Raymond held it in.
He held it in. He kept it going. But then you were going to spring forward to the next part of the Bea story.
Yeah. So in 2008, it was like the fiscal crisis, like when the stock market crashed, and it was awful for us. Like, the city was really late paying us. A lot of our foundations kind of put the brakes on. They didn't want to give their money out when the stock market had reduced the money so much.
Right.
They were trying to wait till it went back up a little bit before they, gave out their funds. Our private donations were also slowing down, and we were just struggling really badly. I didn't have the money to pay the rents. We by that time we had 6 or 7 apartments and,
right.
A drop-in program. And I just was really struggling to pay the rent. I was really struggling to make the payrolls. I was really struggling to pay the, health insurance for the staff. It was all a mess. And we were getting further and further in the hole. And then one day I was driving to work, and, one of my staff called me and said that she'd just gotten a phone call from one of our landlords saying that if we didn't bring the rent immediately up to date, they were going to start eviction proceedings. And I just felt like, I'd been kind of balancing this house of cards, trying to just pay people as little as possible, as late as possible. And it just felt like, okay, it's all collapsing.
Right. It was the final straw.
Yeah. And I was so stressed out that I couldn't keep driving. I actually pulled my car off to the side of the road and started walking up and down the edge of the highway. And, I'm a Catholic boy, so I started praying, and I was praying to all the saints I could think of. And, but I was also praying to people that I knew were dead, who I figured were, I prayed to Ali Forney, and I prayed to my mother, and I prayed to Sylvia Rivera, who'd been nice to our kids at one point. And, I prayed to Bea Arthur. She had just died a few months earlier. And, I knew she cared about us. So then, finally I calmed down enough to get back in my car, drove into the city, got to my office, checked my voicemail. And there was a message from a guy named Billy Goldenberg, who was a famous film score producer. I think he wrote the music for, I forget, maybe Star Wars or something. But he was a very famous film score producer. And he was very close friends with Bea Arthur, and he had accompanied her on the piano during her one-woman show for us, and also when she was on Broadway. But so, I called Billy back, and he's like, Carl, we want to put on a really top-notch memorial service for Bea at, one of the big Broadway theaters, and we'd like you to be a co-producer of the event. And I was like, Billy, I run the program for homeless kids. What do I know about producing Broadway memorials for superstars?
Right.
I'm flattered you're asking me, but I don't know why you're asking me this. And he's like, look, you would be a figurehead producer. We want to be able to have we want to raise some money to put on a production worthy of Bea. And so we think people will be more likely to give their money if it's tax deductible. So they would give money to the Ali Forney Center to put on this the thing. And then he said, we figured it made sense to ask you because you're at the very top of the list of the beneficiaries of Bea Arthur's will.
And this is the first you'd heard about the will.
Yeah. Yeah. She it turned out that she left us $300,000. Wow. So, that got us through the 2008, 2009. Like, I don't think we would have made it if it hadn't been for Bea doing that for us. And
at the time you needed it the most. And your prayer was answered.
I know, it was crazy. I mean, it was like, it actually scared me. Like, how could it be that I'm in this moment of desperation praying to Bea Arthur, and then half an hour later, I find out that Bea Arthur is giving us $300,000. It was like truth is stranger than fiction. If somebody wrote this in a novel, nobody would believe it.
Well, you write a lot about faith and saints and prayer, and I love those parts of the book. You wrestle with a lot of it at times, but then you also describe these moments of grace where it all comes together. There's one where you're on a train with some of the kids to Coney Island or coming back from Coney Island. Can you talk a little bit about that moment?
Yeah, that was a profound moment in my life. So, there's something that happens to you when you are dealing with tragedy day in and day out, where you kind of become numb a little bit. Like, I think it's a survival mechanism. Like, you can't be enraged all the time. You can't be terrified all the time. You have to keep living your life, and you have to, keep going. And those were the days when the kids were getting killed in the streets, when there was nowhere safe for them to go. And but they were also getting infected with AIDS all the time. Kids were dealing with suicide. It was also like when they were gentrifying Times Square and the kids were getting arrested all the time. So it was just like bad stuff happening all the time. And I think I'd gotten to a point after 2 years where I was beginning to numb myself a little bit. So we had this day where we took all the kids to Coney Island, spent the day jumping in the waves and having water splash battles and just a fun day with kids at the beach. And when we went out, there were maybe 40 of us, staff and clients. But they had peeled off during the day. And at the end of the day, when there were only about 10 of us left, that was when I was able to take us on the amusement park rides because I didn't have money to do it for more than 10 people. And then, finally, I took the last straggling kids home with me. And, right. It was about 5 of us at that point. And I was sitting in the subway. They were sitting across from me. It was actually 4 kids and a baby. It was Ali, 3 of the other young people. One of them was a young mother who just had a baby that she had named Precious Jewel. And I was just looking at them playing with the baby. And it was sort of like the scales of numbness or something fell off my eyes. And I could see them for who they were. I could see how beautiful they were. I could see how precious their lives were. It was like I could see that they were beloved. And it was just like my heart felt so much warmth for these kids. And it was like I would do anything to protect them like that. And that's when but then it turned bad in a way because it's like, finally, the ride the subway came to where I was going to have to get off and transfer to a train to take me home. And I knew these kids were going to be out on the streets with nowhere safe to go. And I just felt the pain that I'd been trying to numb myself from so acutely. I just felt so terrified for these kids. How could this be that they have to be out in the streets, suffering like this? I just, I wanted to die almost. But it was this real profound moment where, like I saw the stakes of what, that the kids were so beloved and so worthy of being protected, and B, like how horrible it was that they were not being protected. And, I think that was like a really important moment in my life. And yeah, like I kind of experienced it as this kind of grace, like this. Like I feel like there's this kind of divine dimension to life that it's there all the time, but we have a hard time seeing it.
Right. Something clears away and we can see it once in a while.
Yeah. And that was like a moment where it just cleared away. And there was Ali and these 3 other kids. And I just knew that they were precious and they were beloved. I'm starting to cry.
That's okay. I cry all the time on this podcast, and I'm crying too.
It was just realizing what danger they were in.
Yeah.
Like there was nothing more important that I could do than to try to protect them.
Yeah, and not just this day, every day. This is an everyday thing. We've been talking about an hour, but I have some more questions. Are you okay to talk for a little longer, or which? Yeah.
Actually, could we run my pig outside for? Like, could you give me like 2 minutes?
No, take all the time with your pig. I'll look at my notes and kind of firm up my thing. First of all, no one has ever said, can you take a break so I can run my pig outside? So before you do that, and you talked about the parrots, and this will be the end of part 1, and then we'll come in on part 2.
Okay.
Working in this world, seeing all of this suffering, and then you come home to a loving husband and animals. What do they give you? And unusual animals, parrots and a pig. And there's more, I know. Are there dogs?
I have a dog and Raymond has a dog.
Yeah.
We also have chickens outside. What do they give me? Love?
Yeah.
I don't know.
But the contrast.
I can be very in my head.
Yeah.
And there's something about, the relationship you have with animals where it's nonverbal, where it's just your presence and their presence and cherishing that's important to me. It gives me a sense of home. I love Raymond and I love our animals, and I feel very grateful that I have a space in my life where I don't have to be this like hero transforming the world, where I can, just be with the creatures that love me and that I love. I think
that's beautiful. All right. Take out your pig and we will continue in part 2. Thanks. All right, that's part 1 of my interview with Carl Siciliano. Come back next week for part 2. There's a story about how Madonna and Lady Gaga decided they wanted to do surprise visits to the center on the same weekend. It was surreal. So we get into that and a lot of other great stuff. All right, so this happened. There was a big festival in LA called the Netflix is a Joke Comedy Festival. And I got to go see some stuff because I'm a media person, and I had a really great time. I saw 4 different shows. The first show that I saw was a comedian from Australia named Celeste Barber, who is hilarious, and she does a lot of stuff about dance. Her tour title is called Backup Dancer, because in Australia growing up, she was a dancer and went to all these classes. And I saw that show with my friend on the same day that I met with the dance agent. So I was like, oh, this really speaks to me as a professional dancer myself. I really resonate with this stuff. But it was really funny. She did this bit about how Taylor Swift is not the greatest dancer, and it was just really well observed. And then she comes out at the end and does a dance. Anyway, it was hilarious, and I was super into it. Okay, the next thing I saw was a comic named Paul Elia at the Hotel Cafe, and he's really funny. I kind of follow him on Instagram, and I have for a long time because I think I ran into him at the Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf on Sunset before it was a Starbucks by the Directors Guild, and he was really friendly, and we just started a conversation, and it turns out he was a comic, and I started following him, and he kind of did a lot of stuff during the pandemic. He would do like shows out of his patio and like trucks in parking lots, and like he's friends with Matt Rife, who really blew up, and they've sort of had this great rise, and his show was really fun. Rami Youssef made a surprise appearance in that one. I love it when people that you don't expect to show up, and that was really cool. And then I saw Hannah Gadsby did a night of genderqueer comics downtown, and it was really cool. And my favorite thing about her is that she did a lot of material about Netflix and the Dave Chappelle of it all, and, you know, free speech and what people can say. And she was kind of like, you know, challenging Netflix. Meanwhile, there's a gigantic cube on the stage that says Netflix is a joke. So it was cool. She talked about how she had big balls, and anyway, smart comic, and that was really cool. And did I probably misgender her in that? I probably did. Hannah Gadsby. All right, Hannah Gadsby was great. So there you go. And the other thing I saw was a comic named Sidney Castillo did a show at the UCB space. I worked with him over 10 years ago. I'm doing this in air quotes, but this was my title. I was the showrunner of a show on Bounce TV, which is a network very few people have. It's not on cable. It's like in the air. I didn't understand it then, and I don't understand it now. But it was a kind of a green screen comedy show based on an online show called Breakdown. It was called Breakdown, BRKDOWN. And it was all African-American young people doing comedy bits and green screen skits and monologues and very pop culture oriented, comedic. And they'd been doing it online. And then when it became a show for Bounce TV, I was hired to be the showrunner. I don't think I would get that job today. I don't know if I should have had that job then, but the kids were amazing. And I thought they were kind of like, to me, they felt like the Peanuts gang. Like they were this bunch of young people, and I did my best. And God, I remember one time I mispronounced the name of the rapper Shakur, and I'm afraid to say his first name because I'm so confused now that I don't remember which way is right. And I got so much. It was not cute. It was not a good day at work. They gave me such a hard time, and deservedly. I should know that then, and I should know it now. But Sidney was one of the writers on that show, and this was over 10 years ago. And it was cool to see him do his thing. And I said hello to him afterwards, and he remembered me, and it was cool. Anyway, the Netflix is a joke fest. It was a fun time, and you could feel it becoming a bigger deal every year in LA. Like, Netflix is moving into this live event space, and they're not fucking around. But it was a fun time. So there's that. That's enough for this week. Thank you so much for listening. I want to give a shout out to Oscar Rosario for mixing the episodes. My theme music is by Mark Daniels for Placement Music. We'll catch you next time on Dennis Anyone. Bye.